this video, we are talking about how to write a first verse. Let's dive right in. So this video is going to be broken down into 4 parts. First, we're going to talk about overall what is the goal of a first verse so we can make sure we're actually achieving that goal. And then we're going to talk about it in terms of the music or the chord progression, the melody, and the lyrics. So let's start with the overall. What is the overall purpose of a first verse? Well, on the practical side, we want to make sure we are capturing the attention of the listener. The first verse is usually going to be the first song section that your listener hears. Once in a while, you start a song with a chorus, but most of the time, a song is going to start with your first verse. So from a practical standpoint, we really want to make sure that we are hooking our listener right away and giving them something that makes them want to keep listening. And then the other main purpose of a first verse is really just to start the story of a song, especially if this is a story-driven song rather than an idea-driven song. You're setting up the story, deciding what is the piece of information I want the listener to have first. Just one more tip before we dive into the instrumentation. Honestly, I would recommend, if you can, you write the chorus of your song first. Now, there's several practical reasons for this, but basically the chorus is sort of the center of your song. Everything else leads to your chorus, or all roads lead to your chorus. This is why your chorus constantly repeats. Usually it's verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, end of the song, because the chorus is the main point. And when you know what the main point and the main theme of your song is, because you wrote your chorus already, it's much easier to figure out what you want to say in your verses, and it is also much easier to write the music of the verses and the melody of the verses, because you know that melody needs to lead into the melody of the chorus. So for writing the music or the chord progression of your first verse, and therefore of all your verses, I really have 2 main tips. The first tip is to make sure you establish the tonic. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. One way is simply to utilize a 1 chord in your verse. This is a really important thing to do because it sets the table for the rest of the song. You want to make clear, hey, this song is in C major, so that the listener's ears know that. Now notice I didn't say the listener knows that, because no listener except for your listeners with perfect pitch and an understanding of music theory are going to listen to your song and say, oh, that's in G major. But they should be able to hear where the musical center of gravity is, so that if you played them the C major chord in a C major song, that they would be able to feel, oh, okay, this is where the song is at rest. This is the conclusion. My other main tip is, honestly, when you're writing your verse, start by writing a riff or hook rather than just a plain chord progression. So why do I think it's good to start with a riff rather than a plain chord progression? Basically because the verse is otherwise going to be almost by default the most boring section of your song. Now, that's not to say that it's going to be boring, but you certainly want to make sure your chorus is more exciting than your verse, and you usually want the bridge to be more exciting than your verse as well. So relative to the rest of the song, your verses are almost always going to be sparser instrumentally and also less interesting melodically. So let's talk about what I mean by sparser instrumentally. Sparser instrumentally just means there are fewer instruments that are playing. Usually in your chorus, you're going to have a whole bunch of guitars playing, and there's just going to be instrument upon instrument upon instrument. Is usually when it might just be an acoustic guitar and you singing, or an acoustic guitar, drums, a piano, and you singing, or just a piano and you singing. So because there are so few instruments, that leaves more room for your instruments to do something more interesting. And it also means that if it's just a melody and just a really boring piano part, that melody really has to carry a lot of weight, which isn't good for a verse because, again, usually a verse is going to have a less interesting melody than the rest of your song. In fact, I think this is why when you listen to most songs, if there is an instrument hook, it almost always is in the verses rather than in the chorus. The chorus is going to be super interesting just by nature of how exciting the melody is going to be and how big it's going to be instrumentally, but your verse doesn't have that luxury, but we can compensate for that by making sure that the verse has an absolutely killer riff or hook. Let's run through just a couple examples of what I mean by a riff or hook. It could be something like a piano riff.
Step 1, you see we need to talk. He walks, you see sit down, it's just a talk. He smiles black.
Or it could be something like a bass line.
Break it down on a cowboy's back. You just have to go there 'cause you don't know why. I know you feel the soul is a beat in the sea.
Or it could be a guitar hook.
Heaven knows that you're with me now. Heaven knows that you're here.
And of course, a riff or hook can take many more forms, but these are going to be some of the most common forms you will see a hook take. All right, let's talk about melody. Melodically, it probably should be the lowest melody of your song. Sometimes a bridge will be lower, and once in a great while, a chorus will be lower, but usually your chorus will be the highest melody of the song, and usually your verses will be the lowest melody of the song. This is another reason why it's helpful to write the chorus first, because you know how high the chorus is once you write it, and you know that you need to now write your verse so that the melody is lower. And very often, a melody for your verse will come across as more relaxed and more conversational than a melody for your chorus. And when I say the melody is more relaxed and conversational, that tends to mean that there are more steps and fewer leaps. So if you don't know what steps and leaps are, basically steps are just anytime you go from one note to the next note, and a leap is anything that's farther than that. Or you can see this another way, it's called conversational. So conversational tends to be relatively monotone, at least compared to how we sing. When I talk, I tend to go up a little bit and I come down a little bit, but I don't talk like, wow, okay, what is that? I don't talk like that, right? That wouldn't be conversational. A chorus tends to do the melodic equivalent of that, but verses tend to be more conversational, like how I'm talking to you now. Hopefully there's a little bit of up and there's a little bit of down, but it's not going up by a ton suddenly. It's not going down by a ton suddenly. Now, again, this is not required, and I think it can actually be a great idea to break outside of this sometimes. But the tendency is that when we compare the chorus to the verses, usually the verses are going to be more conversational, more relaxed. It's going to be lower. It's going to have fewer extreme leaps. So it's going to be a bit more of a calm, perhaps intimate melody. All right, so let's talk about the lyrics of our first verse. Their main job is to set the stage for the chorus and set up the story for the rest of the song. I think a good comparison for a first verse is a TV show pilot. A good TV show pilot will convince you to at least watch the next episode. A great TV pilot might even convince you to commit to watching the whole season just because that pilot was so good. So your first verse is really your first opportunity to hook your listener and make sure that they are invested and want to see where the song is going. Something you should try to do right away in your first verse is to establish the who, the where, and the when. And also, if you have any symbolism that you're going to use, establish that right away as well. Now, the main reason for this, as Pat Pattison points out, is that gravity pulls things down. So if you establish a symbolism in the first line of the song, the whole rest of the song gets that context. In the same way that if you put paint at the top of a wall, gravity will bring it down. Once we have that context, once we have that image in our mind and we have a firm grasp of who this is about, when this is happening, and where it's happening, once we have that in our head, we're not going to lose that for the rest of the song. So it's important to establish that early so the listener knows who the song is about, where it's happening, and when it's happening. Or how Pat Pattison put it very simply, show before you tell. So put the symbolism early in the song and then tell your story. And this may seem obvious, but if you have already written your chorus, it's really important for your first verse that you figure out what is the one thing that verse needs to communicate before the chorus comes. If your song is about how much love can hurt, if your first verse doesn't communicate, hey, by the way, this person I'm talking about in the rest of the first verse broke up with me, love hurts. It wouldn't make sense if we just say, oh, you're so amazing and wonderful and beautiful, love hurts. It'd be like, well, wait a second. Yeah, but where did that come from? We need to establish, before we get to the love hurts, why it is we're saying love hurts. So to put this all together, if you're sitting down and you need to write a first verse, what you should do, in my opinion, is write a riff or hook first, or a chord progression that's actually interesting and has sort of a hook inside of it, something memorable musically. Then from there, figure out the melody that can go on top of that chord progression or that hook or riff, and then figure out your lyrics for your first verse, understanding that this is setting the stage for the rest of your song, and this is the first piece of the story that you're giving the listener. Hopefully this was helpful to you. If it was, something else you'll probably find helpful is my 10 different ways to start writing a song guide. This will help you dive right into songwriting, because sometimes the hardest part of songwriting, or the hardest part of anything creative, is just to get started, to have some ideas. And this will give you 10 different ways to get started with your song, because I think a great way to make sure that you never really have writer's block is to simply change up how you approach writing songs. If sometimes you approach them by by coming up with a song title and then reverse engineering what would a song called that be about. And sometimes instead you start with a piano riff or a bass line or a guitar hook. That's a great way to make sure that we never really get writer's block. So if that seems interesting to you, be sure to check that out. Link in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.